Forget the gleaming marble of the Parthenon and the birth of democracy. Forget the sagas of epic heroes and the profound wisdom of philosophers that have echoed through millennia. We journey back to the heart of ancient Greece, but we are not visiting the landmarks you know or the history you were taught. We are pulling back the covers on a civilization so gripped by a primal terror of night, it would make your most chilling horror movie feel like a gentle lullaby. What if I told you that for the very people who laid the foundations of Western thought, closing your eyes at night wasn't a peaceful surrender to rest? What if it was a deliberate, terrifying descent into the realm of the dead? They believed sleep was a nightly curse, a terrifying rehearsal for their own demise, a journey into the underworld where their soul could be stolen by vengeful gods, their abandoned body possessed by demons, and their dreams could land them in a real-world courtroom, facing exile or even death. This isn't just a collection of forgotten myths. It's the story of a 2,000-year-old nightmare, a cultural trauma so deep that it has secretly shaped the way we think, the way we work, and even the way we sleep today. Get comfortable, perhaps more comfortable than any ancient Greek ever was, and prepare to have every romantic notion you've ever held about the cradle of our civilization utterly and completely shattered. Our journey into the darkness begins with beliefs so fundamental and so alien to our modern minds that it colored every aspect of ancient Greek life. They genuinely believed that sleep was a curse placed upon humanity by the gods, not a natural biological function, but a malevolent affliction. This wasn't some fringe superstition whispered by the uneducated masses in hushed tones. This was mainstream Greek theology, a core tenet of their worldview that influenced their architecture, their medicine, their politics, and their daily schedules. The Greeks constructed an entire mythology to explain why the simple act of falling asleep was one of the most dangerous things a human could do. According to their beliefs, the cosmos was governed by an intricate family of deities, and two of the most feared were twin brothers who lived together in the eternal gloom of the underworld. One was Thanatos, the other was his brother. This was no mere poetic metaphor. It was a literal family tree of terror. Hypnos would emerge from the depths of Hades to visit the mortal world, and in doing so, he was essentially allowing mortals to practice what his brother Thanatos did permanently. Sleep was considered a rehearsal for death. Every morning that you woke up was seen not as a given, but as a temporary reprieve from the inevitable, a lucky escape from the clutches of the underworld. But this is where a chilling belief turns into a truly disturbing psychological reality. The Greeks were convinced that during the vulnerable hours of sleep, your very essence would partially detach from your physical body and wander aimlessly in the realm of the dead. This terrifying journey left you exposed to a host of supernatural threats. They feared that evil spirits, wandering the spectral planes, could stumble upon your empty vessel and decide to take up residence, possessing your abandoned body. They were terrified that the gods and their capricious and often cruel games could snatch your wandering soul for their own inscrutable purposes, leaving your body an empty shell. Or perhaps most horrifyingly, you could simply get lost in the labyrinthine corridors of the underworld and never find your way back, your body slowly growing cold in your bed. This wasn't just abstract theology discussed by priests in remote temples. It had real, practical consequences that dictated how millions of Greeks lived their daily lives. This pervasive fear of the night led them to develop elaborate and deeply ingrained protective rituals that had to be performed before daring to close their eyes. They arranged their homes and their bedrooms in very specific, almost ritualistic ways to ward off these supernatural threats. Windows were positioned not for the view, but to prevent the entry of malevolent spirits. Beds were placed according to complex astrological and spiritual calculations. They lived in a state of constant, low-grade anxiety about what might befall them during those vulnerable hours of unconsciousness. The fear was so palpable that it bled into the most rational of their sciences. Ancient Greek medical texts, including the revered works of Hippocrates, the father of medicine, described sleep as one of the most dangerous times for human health. They held that during sleep, the body's natural defenses were catastrophically lowered, making you susceptible to a host of maladies. They believed the body was vulnerable to invasion by what they called evil humors, a concept central to their medical theory, where an imbalance of bodily fluids could lead to disease and spiritual corruption. The most respected scientific minds of their time actually recommended that people sleep as little as possible to minimize these risks. More sleep meant more time spent in a state of profound vulnerability. The societal fear of sleep was so intense that many Greeks suffered from what we would now instantly recognize as severe insomnia and chronic anxiety disorders. But in a terrifying twist of cultural logic, instead of treating these as the debilitating medical problems they were, Greek society praised people who could function on minimal sleep. These individuals were seen as spiritually superior. Their ability to resist the curse of hypnos a sign that they were closer to the immortal gods. This belief was championed by their greatest thinkers. The philosopher Aristotle, a titan of Western thought, described sleep as a form of temporary madness, a period where the rational mind lost its grip on reality and allowed chaotic, dangerous thoughts to flood the consciousness. His mentor, Plato, offered an equally grim metaphor, comparing sleep to being temporarily imprisoned in a dark cave, where you could only perceive faint shadows and illusions instead of the true, illuminated reality of the world. These weren't just idle philosophical musings. They had brutal, practical applications that trickled down into the education of the elite. Students at the great philosophical schools were often required to stay awake for days on end to prove their intellectual dedication and their mastery over the body's base needs. Some philosophical sects, in their pursuit of enlightenment, believed that it was necessary to conquer the need for sleep entirely. Perhaps the most extreme and famous example of this philosophy was the school of the Cynics. They believed that any form of physical comfort, including the simple pleasure of adequate sleep, was morally corrupting. Diogenes, the most famous Cynic philosopher, took this belief to its theatrical extreme. He reportedly chose to sleep in a large ceramic jar in the middle of a bustling marketplace, deliberately selecting the most uncomfortable and public sleeping arrangement possible to serve as a living demonstration of his utter rejection of worldly comfort and his mastery over the curse of sleep. This anti-sleep ideology was woven into the very fabric of their religious practices as well. Many Greek temples had strict rules forbidding anyone from sleeping on sacred grounds. Logic was that sleeping in such close proximity to the gods would expose a vulnerable, wandering mortal soul to divine energies so powerful that their minds couldn't handle them safely. The oracle at Delphi, one of the most important and sacred religious sites in the entire ancient Greek world, had elaborate and deeply serious protocols surrounding sleep and dreams. The priestesses who delivered the famous prophecies were required to follow strict and often punishing sleep schedules, and they frequently used sleep deprivation as a deliberate tool to induce the altered states of consciousness they believed were necessary for divine communication. Exhaustion was a gateway to the gods. The physical reality of where the Greeks slept was a direct and brutal extension of this philosophy that comfort was a sin. Forget everything you've seen in Hollywood movies, with their depictions of elegant couches, soft cushions, and flowing drapes. The truth is so much more brutal than you can possibly imagine. The ancient Greeks didn't just sleep uncomfortably by accident. They deliberately designed their sleeping surfaces to be as harsh and as unforgiving as humanly possible, and they had deeply ingrained philosophical and religious reasons for this self-inflicted torture. Let's start with a fact that will sound completely insane to our modern sensibilities. The typical ancient Greek bed, for nearly everyone from the common citizen to the wealthy elite, was essentially a wooden platform with taut leather straps stretched across it like a primitive trampoline of pain. There was no mattress, no cushions, and no padding of any kind. It was just hardwood and unforgiving leather that would leave deep, permanent marks on your body after a single night's sleep. And this wasn't a mark of poverty. It was the standard. But this is where it gets truly disturbing. The Greeks genuinely believed that sleeping on any kind of soft surface would make you weak, lazy, and morally corrupt. They thought that physical comfort during sleep would soften not just your character and your very soul. In their minds, a hard, unforgiving bed was an essential tool for maintaining virtue, discipline, and spiritual strength. The most extreme and horrifying example of this philosophy came from the Spartans, who took the concept of uncomfortable sleeping to a level that would violate modern human rights laws. Spartan children, as part of their infamous military training, were required to sleep on beds made from reeds that they had gathered themselves from the riverbanks. These reeds were deliberately chosen because they were scratchy, provided absolutely no cushioning, and became even more agonizingly uncomfortable as they dried out and hardened. But here is the truly horrifying part. Spartan boys were not allowed to use blankets or any form of covering, regardless of the weather. They were forced to sleep naked on these reed beds in all seasons, including the cold Greek winters when temperatures could plummet below freezing. It is a historical certainty that many of these children died from exposure, but this was not seen as a tragedy. It was considered an acceptable, even necessary, cause for forging warriors with properly hardened characters. The philosophical schools imposed their own forms of brutal sleeping requirements. Students at Plato's prestigious academy were required to sleep on cold, hard stone slabs as a fundamental part of their education. The idea was that this constant physical discomfort would keep their minds sharp and prevent them from becoming too attached to worldly pleasures that could cloud their philosophical judgment. Aristotle's Lyceum had similar requirements, but took the educational torture a step further. Students there had to sleep on specially designed beds that were deliberately unstable. If you moved too much in your sleep, the bed would tip over, crashing you to the floor. This was supposed to train them to remain perfectly still and controlled even while unconscious, a demonstration of the mind's complete mastery over the physical body. The religious implications of these sleeping surfaces even more extreme. Many Greek temples required pilgrims to sleep on bare stone floors as part of their spiritual purification rituals. The famous temple of Asclepius, the god of healing, had special sleeping chambers where sick and desperate people would lie on cold marble slabs, believing that the intense discomfort would make them more receptive to divine healing energies sent by the god. Known as incubation, was a cornerstone of their medical religious system. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of Greek bed culture was the social hierarchy. The hardness of your bed was a literal status symbol. The more uncomfortable your sleeping surface, the higher your perceived social and moral standing. Wealthy Greek citizens would actively compete with one another to see who could endure the most brutal sleeping conditions. Some would commission beds made entirely of metal, which would become scorching hot in the summer and freezing cold in the winter. Others would choose beds covered in sharp objects or rough, abrasive textures that would cause constant pain throughout the night. This wasn't masochism, it was social signaling. By demonstrating that you could endure these torturous conditions, you were proving your virtue, your self-discipline, and your fundamental fitness for leadership. Political candidates would actually campaign on how little comfort they needed, using their sleeping habits as tangible evidence of their moral superiority. The contrast of what the Greeks considered soft, sleeping was striking. Any form of padding, cushioning, or comfort was associated with foreign corruption, feminine weakness, or what they termed barbarian decadence. The Greeks looked down on cultures like the Persians and the Egyptians, who used soft bedding, seeing this as clear evidence of their moral inferiority and their unfitness for self-governance. Their own medical theories supported this harsh worldview. Physicians like Hippocrates taught that soft beds would cause the body's humors to become unbalanced, leading to disease, mental weakness, and a premature death. They argued that hard surfaces helped to maintain proper circulation and prevented the accumulation of harmful bodily fluids. But the most disturbing medical practice involved something they called corrective sleeping. Greeks who showed signs of moral weakness, like laziness or physical illness, would be prescribed even harder sleeping surfaces as a form of treatment. Some were made to sleep on beds covered with sharp stones, thorns, or even metal spikes, a practice that was supposedly meant to drive out the spiritual or physical corruption that was causing their problems. Women in Greek society faced particularly brutal sleeping requirements that reflected the deeply misogynistic attitudes about gender and virtue. Greek women were often required to sleep on harder surfaces than men because they were considered to be naturally more prone to moral corruption and therefore needed extra hardening to maintain their virtue. Pregnant women had to endure special sleeping arrangements designed to ensure their children would be born with the proper, hardened character. They were made to sleep on beds that became progressively harder throughout their pregnancy, with a horrified belief that this would somehow transfer strength and virtue to their unborn children. And for the vast population of Greek slaves, their sleeping arrangements were so horrific that they can barely be described as beds at all. Slaves typically slept on the bare ground, often outdoors, regardless of the weather conditions. When they were provided with indoor sleeping spaces, these were usually just cold, damp stone floors in basements or storage areas, with no protection from the cold, the dampness, or the vermin that infested such places. The physical and psychological impact of these sleeping arrangements on the ancient Greeks must have been enormous. Chronic physical discomfort from their beds, combined with the sleep deprivation they already practiced, would have profoundly affected their mood, their cognitive function, and their overall health in ways that probably shaped their entire culture and worldview. As if the psychological terror of a cursed sleep and the physical torture of their beds weren't enough, the Greeks added another layer of extreme practice to their nightly rituals, what they wore, or more accurately. Imagine walking into an ancient Greek bedroom at midnight and finding dozens of completely naked people, men, women, and children, sleeping together in the same room. This wasn't some wild, scandalous party. This was completely normal, socially acceptable behavior that reveals one of the most shocking aspects of ancient Greek culture. Their approach to nighttime nudity was so extreme and so fundamentally different from our modern values that it would make a modern reality TV show look conservative. The ancient Greeks didn't just occasionally sleep naked. They considered wearing any kind of clothes to bed to be unhealthy, unnatural, and morally suspicious. But this wasn't about personal comfort or a sense of freedom. The Greek culture of nudity was tied to a complex web of beliefs about health, social status, spiritual purity, and even political loyalty that created sleeping situations so bizarre they would shock people from any other culture in history. Let's begin with a concept that is going to sound absolutely unbelievable to our modern ears. Ancient Greeks believed that wearing clothes while sleeping would trap what they called evil vapors in your body, leading to disease, madness, and spiritual corruption. They held a firm belief that the human body needed to breathe through the skin during sleep, and that any form of cover would interfere with this essential biological process. Their most respected medical texts, including the works of Hippocrates and later Galen, contain detailed and seemingly scientific explanations of why sleeping in clothes was dangerous. They believed that during sleep, the body naturally expelled toxic humors through the pores of the skin. Clothing, they argued, would force these poisons back into the body, causing everything from a raging fever to outright insanity. But this medical justification was just the beginning of a much deeper philosophical and cultural practice. Greek philosophy also taught that sleeping naked was essential for moral and intellectual development. Plato wrote that covering the body during sleep showed a lack of confidence in one's natural state and was an indication of a spiritual weakness that could corrupt the soul. The most extreme champions of this philosophy were, once again, they believed that any form of artificial covering was a rejection of a natural, virtuous life and a clear sign of moral corruption. They didn't just sleep naked in the privacy of their homes. They did so in public spaces, in marketplaces, on the steps of temples, claiming that true virtue required a complete and utter rejection of all social conventions around modesty. But here's where this cultural practice takes a truly shocking and authoritarian turn. Their nudity wasn't just an individual choice. In many powerful Greek institutions, sleeping naked was mandatory, and wearing clothes to bed could result in severe punishment, exile, or in some extreme cases, this wasn't about personal freedom. It was about forced conformity to cultural norms that seem absolutely insane by our modern standards. Greek military culture took naked sleeping to extremes that would violate every single modern military regulation. Spartan soldiers were required to sleep naked together in large communal barracks, regardless of the weather conditions. The logic behind this was that shared nudity would build a powerful sense of brotherhood, eliminate class distinctions, and create unbreakable bonds that would make them more effective and fearless in the heat of battle. The Spartan Agoj training system included elaborate naked sleeping arrangements designed to test the young men's comfort with physical vulnerability. Boys as young as 7 were required to sleep naked in large groups, with older boys supervising them to ensure that no one tried to cover themselves or seek any form of comfort. But the most disturbing aspect of Spartan naked sleeping was how it was used as a form of brutal psychological conditioning. Boys who showed any sign of discomfort with the naked sleeping arrangements were marked as unsuitable for the warrior class and could be demoted to a lower social status, in some cases enslaved. Your ability to sleep naked in public was a direct measure of your worth as a Spartan. The famous Greek gymnasia also mandated naked sleeping for their athletes and students. The word gymnasium literally means a place of nakedness, and this extended to their sleeping arrangements as well as to their exercise and education. Students at the gymnasia were required to sleep naked together in large dormitory-style arrangements that would be considered wildly inappropriate by any modern standard. These requirements weren't just about physical conditioning. They were about social and psychological training. Young Greek men were taught from a young age that comfort with public nudity was essential for citizenship and for their moral development. Their religious practices also incorporated naked sleeping in ways that were central to their spiritual beliefs. Many Greek temples required pilgrims to sleep naked as part of their purification rituals, believing that clothing would interfere with divine communication and spiritual healing. The Temple of Asclepius had its special sleeping chambers where sick people would lie naked on cold stone floors, believing that the combination of nudity and discomfort would make them more receptive to the divine, healing dreams sent by the god. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of Greek naked sleeping was how it affected family life and domestic arrangements. Greek households often had communal sleeping areas where family members, servants, and even guests would all sleep naked together in the same room. This was not considered strange or inappropriate. It was seen as natural and healthy. The Greeks believed that this practice of shared naked sleeping strengthened family bonds, eliminated secrets and deceptions, and created a sense of transparency that was essential for the proper management of the household. Women in Greek society faced particularly complex and contradictory rules around naked sleeping. While men's naked sleeping was celebrated as virtuous and natural, women's nudity was simultaneously required, and yet strictly controlled in ways that must have created impossible psychological pressures. Married Greek women were required to sleep naked with their husbands as a demonstration of their marital virtue and openness, but at the same time, they were expected to maintain a strict sense of modesty and sexual, creating a series of contradictions that must have been psychologically devastating for many women. The most disturbing practice involved young Greek women, who were required to sleep naked in groups as part of their preparation for marriage. These sleeping arrangements were supervised by older women who would monitor the girls' behavior and report any signs of what they considered improper conduct or unwelcome sexual development. The social implications of naked sleeping in ancient Greece were enormous. Your comfort level with public nudity literally determined your social status, your political opportunities, and even your marriage prospects. Even the transition from day to night, a moment we might find peaceful, was a source of profound terror for the ancient Greeks. As the sun began to set over the Aegean Sea, something absolutely terrifying would happen, something that would make a modern person think they had stepped into the middle of a horror movie. The moment twilight arrived, entire cities would transform into scenes of sheer panic as people desperately performed elaborate survival rituals to protect themselves for what they believed was a literal poison falling from the sky. The ancient Greeks didn't just dislike nighttime. They were utterly convinced that the transition from day to night released toxic vapors into the air that could kill you within hours of exposure. And again, this wasn't just a superstition held by a few uneducated people. This was mainstream Greek medical theory that influenced government policy, military strategy, and daily life for centuries. Here's something that will truly blow your mind. Ancient Greek cities actually had official sunset warnings that were announced by town criers every single evening. These weren't gentle reminders to head home for dinner. They were urgent public health announcements, warning citizens that deadly atmospheric conditions were about to begin and that any exposure could result in immediate illness or even death. The Greek medical theory behind this citywide terror was incredibly detailed and sophisticated, even though it was completely and utterly wrong. Greek physicians taught that during the transition from day to night, the sun's retreat from the sky allowed dangerous miasmas, or poisonous air, to rise to the earth and spread through the atmosphere. According to the Hippocratic medical texts, these evening vapors contain concentrated doses of the four harmful humors that could instantly throw your body's natural balance into a state of deadly chaos. Breathing this night air was thought to cause fever, madness, plague, and a terrifying condition, evening sickness, that could kill a perfectly healthy person within a matter of days. But the Greeks took this terrifying theory even further. They believed that different types of evening air could cause different diseases. Vapors rising from marshlands were thought to cause malaria and fever. Air that drifted from cemeteries was believed to carry the restless spirits of the dead that could possess living people who inhaled them. Coastal evening air was considered especially dangerous because they believed it mixed the sea vapors with the land vapors, creating uniquely toxic combinations that could cause instant respiratory failure. Greek military campaigns were actually planned around these bizarre beliefs about poisonous evening air. Armies would refuse to march or to fight during the twilight hours, not because of problems with visibility, but because commanders genuinely believed that exposure to these evening vapors would weaken their troops and make them vulnerable to an enemy attack. The famous Battle of Marathon in 490 BC was partially timed around these Greek beliefs about evening air toxicity. The Greek commanders insisted on fighting during the daylight hours, not just for a tactical advantage, but because they believed their soldiers would be literally poisoned if the battle extended into the evening hours. But the most shocking aspect of this evening air terror was how it affected daily life in the Greek cities. As sunset approached, people would begin elaborate protective rituals that could take hours to complete and often involve the entire household working together to create barriers against the incoming poison. Greek homes were designed with special architectural features to protect against these evening vapors. Houses had complex ventilation systems that could be sealed shut at sunset, preventing the toxic night air from entering their living spaces. Wealthy families had servants whose only job was to monitor the atmospheric conditions and seal the house at the first sign that dangerous vapors were detected. The most elaborate protective measure was something called vapor barriers, which Greeks would create around their homes every evening. These involved burning specific combinations of herbs and incense to create protective smoke screens that they believed would neutralize the incoming poison vapors. Different regions of Greece had their own specialized vapor protection recipes based on their local atmospheric conditions and the plants that were available. The Athenians, for example, favored combinations of thyme and rosemary, believing that these herbs could neutralize the specific toxins that rose from their coastal location. The Spartans used more aggressive mixtures, including sulfur and burning animal hair, creating a smoke so thick and noxious that it probably caused more health problems than it ever prevented. The psychological impact of this daily evening terror on the ancient Greeks was devastating. Imagine living your entire life with a certain knowledge that every single sunset brought with it the threat of a deadly poisoning. It's no wonder that Greek literature is filled with descriptions of the evening panic that would grip the cities as the sun began its descent. When the ancient Greeks finally managed to fall asleep, despite the profound terrors about their beds, their nudity, and the poisonous evening air, they entered what they believed was the most dangerous battlefield in existence, the realm of dreams. This was a place where your very soul could be stolen, corrupted, or utterly destroyed by forces beyond human comprehension. What you are about to hear will completely change the way you think about nightmares. Because for the ancient Greeks, bad dreams weren't just scary experiences. They were literal acts of warfare committed against your spirit. The Greeks didn't see dreams as random brain activity or subconscious processing, as we do today. They believed that dreams were actual visits to otherworldly realms where you encounter gods, demons, the spirits of the dead, and a host of other supernatural beings who were all fighting for control of your immortal soul. Closing your eyes meant stepping onto a battlefield where the outcome could determine your fate in both life and death. Here's something that sounds utterly insane to us now. The Greeks had an entire professional class of people whose sole job was to interpret and manage the spiritual warfare that happened in dreams. These weren't just fortune tellers or mystics. They were considered essential medical professionals whose expertise could literally save your life by helping you navigate the treacherous supernatural conflicts that played out in your sleep. Greek dream interpretation was incredibly sophisticated and detailed. Different types of dreams were believed to come from different supernatural sources. Interpreters had elaborate classification systems for determining whether a dream was sent by helpful gods, malicious demons, or the spirits of the dead seeking revenge. Dreams that featured bright light or the sensation of flying were usually attributed to benevolent gods like Apollo or Zeus, and were considered messages of divine favor or guidance. But dreams involving darkness, falling, or being chased were seen as direct attacks by malicious supernatural forces that were trying to corrupt or possess the dreamer's soul. The most terrifying dreams of all were those that featured dead people, because the Greeks believed these were actual visitations from spirits who were trying to drag living people with them into the underworld. If you dreamed about a deceased family member or a friend, it wasn't considered a comforting reunion. It was seen as a supernatural abduction attempt that required immediate and serious spiritual intervention. But perhaps the most shocking and terrifying aspect of Greek dream culture was something called dream prosecution. The Greeks believed that the actions you took in your dreams could have real, tangible legal and moral consequences. If you committed a crime in a dream, if you murdered someone, or if you dishonored the gods, you could actually be put on trial and punished for your dream behavior. This wasn't just a theoretical or philosophical concept. There are actual court records from ancient Athens that show people being prosecuted for dream crimes. In 415 BC, several prominent Athenian citizens were charged with sacrilege based on dreams they had reported about defacing religious statues. The prosecutors argued that the dreams themselves were evidence of treasonous intentions, even though no actual physical crimes had been committed. The psychological pressure being held legally responsible for the content of your own dreams was enormous and created a living nightmare. Greeks would often hire dream interpreters not just to understand their dreams, but to help them construct potential legal defenses against dream-based prosecutions. Terrified of having legally problematic dreams that they would try to stay awake for days at a time. This created a vicious cycle where their sleep deprivation made them more likely to have disturbing and chaotic dreams when they finally did collapse from exhaustion, which in turn increased their legal vulnerability and their anxiety. This culture of sleep as a trial by ordeal, a dangerous journey, and a moral test created a society that was, by its very nature, exhausted. This exhaustion permeated every level of their civilization, from the political chambers where democracy was born, to the training grounds of their fiercest warriors, and even to the quiet homes of ordinary families. The political system we celebrate as the foundation of modern civilization was, in reality, run by exhausted leaders whose judgment was chronically impaired by deliberate sleep deprivation. The Athenian democracy, which we so admire, required its citizens to participate in all-night political assemblies that could last for days without any breaks for sleep. This wasn't for occasional emergencies. This was their standard operating procedure for making important decisions about war, law, and public policy. The Athenian ecclesia, their main democratic assembly, would often begin its deliberations at sunset and continue through the night and well into the following day. Citizens who fell asleep during these marathon sessions were not only denied their right to vote, they were often publicly shamed and could even face legal penalties for failing to fulfill their civic duties. The disastrous Sicilian expedition of 415 BC, a military blunder that led to Athens losing the Peloponnesian War and ultimately its empire, was decided during one of these all-night assembly sessions. Historical accounts describe citizens who were literally hallucinating from exhaustion, voting to send the entire Athenian navy on a doomed military adventure that would destroy their civilization. This reverence for endurance overrest athletic and military cultures. Greek Olympic athletes were required to sleep on the bare ground outdoors in all weather conditions for the entire year leading up to the games. This was 365 days of sleeping on rocks, dirt, and mud, regardless of rain, snow, or freezing temperatures. Their coaches developed elaborate sleep deprivation protocols, forcing athletes to stay awake for 48 to 72 hours at a time, followed by only brief periods of rest. Spartan training, as we've seen, was even more extreme, using sleep torture to create soldiers who were psychologically incapable of normal human responses to violence and suffering. Boys were conditioned from the age of 7 to be emotionally numb through years of deliberate psychological damage, turning them into peerless killing machines at the cost of their own humanity. And all of this, the philosophy, the military might, was built on a foundation of unimaginable suffering. The Greek economy, the engine that powered their golden age, was entirely dependent on a system of slavery that used sleep deprivation as its primary tool of control. Slaves were typically allowed only 2 to 3 hours of sleep per day, and this rest had to be taken in conditions so horrific, flooded underground chambers, chained in painful positions, that many slaves preferred to stay awake. This chronic exhaustion made them compliant and incapable of planning rebellions. The splendor of Greek civilization was built on the broken bodies and broken spirits of millions of people who were never allowed the simple human dignity of a good night's rest. What is truly shocking, however, is not just that these nightmares occurred, but that they never truly ended. The reason you might feel a pang of guilt about taking a nap, the reason you might boast about pulling an all-nighter for work or school, the reason you might secretly believe that sleep is for the weak, this is in your own original opinion. Ancient Greek programming that had been running in the background of Western culture for over 2,000 years. The sleep nightmares we've explored tonight didn't stay buried in the ruins of ancient Greece. They evolved, they spread, and they are still actively shaping how you think about rest, work, and success in ways you probably never realized. The ancient Greek attitudes towards sleep created a kind of cultural DNA that infected the Roman Empire, and from there, all of Western civilization. It continues to influence our modern lives in ways that are both subtle and profound. Every time you feel lazy for sleeping in on a weekend, every time you wear your sleep deprivation like a badge of honor, every time you push your body through sheer exhaustion to prove your dedication to a job or a project, you are participating in a tradition that began with ancient Greeks who literally tortured themselves in the name of virtue. Let's draw a direct line from their world to ours. The modern hustle culture that celebrates working 80-hour weeks and treats sleep as a foolish waste of time isn't a new invention of the digital age. It is a direct descendant of the ancient Greek philosophical schools that taught their students to stay awake for days at a time to prove their intellectual superiority. When modern entrepreneurs brag about getting only 4 hours of sleep a night while building their companies, they are unconsciously echoing the Spartan, warriors who competed to see who could function on the least amount of rest. The language may have changed from virtue to productivity, but the underlying belief that sleep equals weakness comes straight from ancient Greek military culture. The modern obsession with biohacking our sleep with technology, drugs, and complex routines isn't revolutionary. It is remarkably similar to the ancient Greek physicians who used toxic substances and extreme procedures to try to control and conquer sleep patterns. We are still trying to dominate sleep rather than working with it as a natural and essential biological process. Our modern political culture also shows these clear connections. Politicians who work around the clock and make profoundly important decisions while they're exhausted are celebrated for their dedication, just like the ancient Athenian leaders who made critical policy choices during those all-night assembly sessions. The business world continues to use sleep deprivation as a tool for employee control, just like the ancient Greek economic systems. The expectation that workers should be available 24/7, the glorification of overtime, and the stigma around taking adequate time off all have their roots in Greek labor practices that treated sleep as wasted productivity. But here is the hopeful part of this long, dark story. Understanding where these destructive attitudes come from gives us the power to question them and, ultimately, to change them. When you recognize that your own feelings of guilt or anxiety about sleep have been shaped by a culture that systematically tortured people through sleep deprivation, you can start to make different, healthier choices for yourself. Modern sleep science, a field the Greeks could never have dreamed of, has shown us that adequate sleep is absolutely essential for everything the Greeks claimed to value: creativity, emotional regulation, immune function, and peak cognitive performance. We now have irrefutable proof that the Greeks were systematically undermining their own potential through their punishing sleep practices. The most successful and innovative modern societies are those that have begun to move away from these Greek-influenced sleep attitudes and toward policies that support healthy sleep. Countries with shorter work weeks, later school start times, and a cultural respect for rest consistently outperform societies that maintain the Greek-style cultures of sleep deprivation. Breaking free from this ancient Greek sleep programming isn't just about our individual health. It's about creating cultures that support human flourishing rather than systematic exhaustion. When we change our attitudes towards sleep, we create new possibilities for innovation, creativity, and social progress that were impossible under the Greek-influenced cultures of exhaustion. The journey we've taken tonight, deep into the shadows of ancient Greece, reveals a secret history that's still alive within our own lives. If you ever felt a strange guilt for resting or pushed yourself to the brink for a goal, you felt the echo of these ancient fears. Our exploration of history's hidden corners is a community effort, and you are a vital part of it. If this journey has opened your eyes and you believe these forgotten stories need to be told, then join our community of nighttime explorers. Help us bring more of history's secrets into the light by hitting that subscribe button and giving this video a thumbs up. And I am genuinely curious, after hearing all this, what's the one Greek practice that shocked you the most? The dream trials? The beds of torture? The poison air? Drop a comment below and let's discuss. I read every single one because it's in sharing our reactions that we truly understand the past and begin to build a better future. Sleep well tonight. And know that you are part of a movement that is choosing wisdom over a very old, very destructive tradition. Sweet dreams.